14-year-old boy murders his teacher, acting untouchable. Then the judge made history. 14-year-old Philip Chisholm sat in the courtroom with his shoulders back and his chin raised, as if he were posing for a photograph instead of facing a charge that made seasoned detectives turn away. He glanced at the victim's family without flinching, without remorse, without even the decency to pretend he understood what he had taken from them. His lawyer leaned over to whisper something, but Philip barely listened. He believed his age was a shield, that the system would treat him like a child who simply made a mistake. But there was nothing childlike about what he had done to his teacher, Colleen Ritzer, and the judge sitting above him had already decided that some crimes shatter the protection of youth. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and tell us what you think below. This is how it all began, October 22, 2013. Danvers High School in Massachusetts. A Tuesday afternoon that felt like every other Tuesday until it didn't. Colleen Ritzer taught math with the kind of patience that made struggling students feel safe. She stayed late because that's what good teachers do. She offered extra help to a freshman who seemed distracted, disconnected, almost hollow behind the eyes. That student was Philip Chisholm. He had transferred to the school just weeks earlier, carrying secrets no one could see. When the final bell rang and the hallways emptied, Colleen stayed behind in her classroom, organizing papers and preparing tomorrow's lesson. Philip stayed too, but he wasn't there for help with equations. He was there because something inside him had already made a decision that would destroy lives, families, and any illusion that children are incapable of true evil. What happened in that classroom over the next hour would shock a nation and force a legal system to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, monsters wear braces and carry backpacks. The courtroom felt smaller than it actually was, not because of its dimensions, but because of the weight pressing down on everyone inside it. Families filled the benches behind the prosecution table, their faces drawn and pale, eyes red from weeks of crying and sleepless nights. Across the aisle, Philip Chisholm sat at the defense table between two attorneys who kept their expressions carefully neutral. He looked like he belonged in a classroom, not a criminal trial. His button-down shirt was pressed, his hair combed neatly to the side, but it was his face that made people uncomfortable. There was no fear there, no shame, just a faint, almost imperceptible curve at the corner of his mouth that suggested he found something about this entire proceeding mildly amusing. The bailiff called the court to order, and everyone rose as Judge David Lowy entered. The judge was a man in his 60s with silver hair and a reputation for fairness that bordered on legendary. He had presided over hundreds of cases, seen every kind of defendant, heard every excuse, witnessed every display of remorse or defiance. But even he paused when he looked down at the 14-year-old boy sitting before him, not because Philip looked dangerous, because he looked so utterly unbothered. The clerk began reading the charges aloud, her voice steady but strained. Each word landed like a hammer. The crime described was not something anyone wanted to imagine, let alone hear spoken in clinical legal language. And yet Philip sat there, legs swinging slightly beneath the table, as if he were waiting for a dentist appointment instead of facing the possibility of spending most of his life behind bars. Behind him in the gallery, Colleen Ritzer's mother pressed a tissue to her face and tried not to make a sound. Her daughter had been 24 years old. She had been kind, dedicated, loved by her students. She had stayed after school to help a boy who seemed to need guidance, and that decision had cost her everything. Now that boy sat a few feet away, staring at nothing in particular, showing no recognition of the devastation he had caused. The prosecutor stood and began outlining the evidence the state would present. Security footage, forensic analysis, witness testimony, a timeline so precise it left no room for doubt. As each piece was mentioned, the defense attorneys scribbled notes, but Philip barely reacted. He tilted his head once, as if considering something trivial, then returned to his blank expression. The judge addressed the defendant directly, asking if he understood the charges against him. Philip stood slowly, almost lazily, and nodded. His voice when he spoke was quiet but clear. He understood. He understood everything. The judge watched him for a long moment, searching for something that wasn't there. Remorse, fear, humanity. Then he glanced at the prosecution and nodded for them to continue. What no one in that courtroom knew, yet, was that the evidence about to be presented would be so overwhelming, so undeniable, that even the defense would struggle to mount a coherent argument. But more than that, the judge had already begun forming an opinion, not about guilt that would come from the jury, but about something deeper, about whether the boy sitting before him truly understood the permanence of what he had done. During a brief recess, reporters clustered in the hallway outside, their voices low but urgent. This was not a typical case. Juvenile defendants charged as adults were rare enough, but ones who showed this level of detachment were almost unheard of. Legal analysts debated whether his age should be a mitigating factor or whether the nature of the crime superseded any consideration of youth. Inside the courtroom, Philip returned to his seat and leaned back slightly, his fingers drumming on the table. His lawyers leaned in to speak with him, their expressions serious, but he waved them off with a small gesture that suggested he wasn't particularly interested in their advice. He glanced back at the gallery once more, his eyes passing over the faces of people whose lives he had irreparably damaged. And then, just for a moment, that faint smirk returned. The bailiff called everyone back to order. The judge returned to the bench, and as the trial moved forward into the presentation of evidence, one thing became abundantly clear to everyone watching. Philip Chisholm believed he was untouchable. He believed that his age, his appearance, his ability to sit quietly and look like a child would somehow insulate him from real consequences. He had no idea that the man sitting above him in black robes had seen this kind of arrogance before, and Judge Lowy knew exactly what it meant. It meant that justice would not be a negotiation. It would be a reckoning. The question was no longer whether Philip would be held accountable. The question was whether he would finally understand what accountability actually meant. And the answer to that question would not come quickly. It would unfold over weeks of testimony, hours of deliberation, and one historic moment when a judge would look a 14-year-old boy in the eyes and deliver a sentence that would change the way the nation thought about youth and justice forever. Colleen Ritzer was 24 years old when she died, but she had already become the kind of teacher students remembered for the rest of their lives. She taught mathematics at Danvers High School, a sprawling brick building in a quiet Massachusetts town where everyone seemed to know everyone else. Her classroom was on the second floor, room 229, and it was decorated with motivational posters and student artwork that she rotated every month to make sure everyone felt included. She arrived early every morning, usually before 7, and spent those quiet hours preparing lessons that would make abstract concepts feel tangible and real. Her colleagues often found her in the teacher's lounge during lunch, grading papers or helping another educator brainstorm ways to reach a struggling student. She never complained about the workload. She never seemed tired. She simply loved what she did. Her students described her as patient beyond measure. If someone didn't understand a problem, she would explain it a different way. If that didn't work, she would try another approach. She never made anyone feel stupid or inadequate. She had a gift for recognizing when a student was dealing with something beyond academics, when a bad grade was really about a bad home situation or undiagnosed anxiety or just the crushing weight of being 14 and overwhelmed. She kept a drawer in her desk filled with granola bars and pencils and notebook paper because she knew some kids came to school without breakfast or supplies. She handed those things out quietly, without making a spectacle, preserving dignity while offering help. Parents loved her because their children actually wanted to go to math class. Administrators valued her because she was reliable, professional, and genuinely invested in the school community. October 22nd started like any other Tuesday. Colleen woke up in her apartment, made coffee, and drove to school while listening to a playlist she had made over the weekend. She parked in her usual spot near the gymnasium entrance and carried her bag of books and papers inside. The morning passed in its predictable rhythm. First period algebra, second period geometry, third period planning time where she answered emails and returned graded assignments. During lunch, she sat with 2 other teachers and talked about an upcoming faculty meeting and whether the school musical would be able to afford the stage lighting they needed. She laughed at a joke someone told, ate a sandwich she had packed that morning, and checked her phone to see a text from her mother asking about dinner plans for the weekend. Everything was normal. Everything was safe. Nothing suggested that in a few hours she would be dead. The afternoon classes began, and Colleen stood at the front of her classroom, walking students through a lesson on polynomial equations. She used colored markers on the whiteboard to differentiate terms, drawing arrows and underlining key steps. Some students took notes diligently. Others stared out the window or texted under their desks when they thought she wasn't looking. She noticed everything but chose her battles carefully, redirecting attention with gentle reminders rather than harsh reprimands. Philip Chisholm sat near the back of the room. He had transferred to Danvers High just weeks earlier, a quiet kid from Tennessee who didn't say much and didn't seem to have made many friends yet. Colleen had noticed he often seemed distracted, disconnected, as if his mind were somewhere far away. She had tried to engage him a few times, asking questions designed to draw him into the lesson, but he usually gave minimal answers and returned to staring at his desk. When the final bell rang at 2:15, students flooded into the hallways, slamming lockers and shouting to each other about weekend plans and football games. Colleen stayed behind in her classroom, as she always did, to tidy up and prepare for the next day. She erased the whiteboard, straightened desks, and gathered stray papers left behind by students. She was supposed to meet a friend for dinner later that evening and was looking forward to it. She thought about stopping at the grocery store on the way home. She thought about calling her sister to check in. She thought about 100 small, ordinary things that living people think about when they assume they have all the time in the world. She didn't notice Philip Chisholm had not left the building. She didn't know he had circled back after pretending to walk toward the exit. She didn't know he was standing in the hallway outside her classroom, waiting. At some point, he entered the room. The exact sequence of what happened next would later be reconstructed through forensic evidence and witness statements, but no one except Philip truly knows what words were exchanged or what final expression crossed Colleen's face. What is known is that she tried to defend herself. She fought. She tried to survive, but she was overpowered by someone who had already decided she would not leave that room alive. The school remained open for after-school activities, clubs, and sports practices, and the building hummed with distant noise from the gymnasium and auditorium. No one heard anything unusual from the second floor. No one walked past room 229 and noticed something was wrong. By the time the sun began to set and the custodial staff started making their rounds, Colleen Ritzer was already gone, and Philip Chisholm had already set into motion a series of events that would expose the darkest parts of human nature and force an entire community to confront a question they never wanted to ask. What do you do when a child commits an unthinkable crime? The first sign that something was wrong came at 6:30 in the evening when Colleen's mother called the school. Colleen had not come home. She had not answered her phone. She had not shown up for dinner plans with a friend, and that was not like her at all. Colleen was responsible, punctual, the kind of person who sent a text if she was running even 5 minutes late. Her mother's voice trembled when she spoke to the school receptionist, asking if anyone had seen her daughter. The receptionist checked the sign-out log and saw that Colleen had not officially left the building. A growing sense of unease spread through the administrative office. Someone was sent to check her classroom. The lights were off. The door was locked. Everything appeared normal from the hallway. But when a custodian unlocked the door and stepped inside, the normalcy shattered. There was blood. Not everywhere, but enough. Enough to know that something violent had occurred. Enough to make the custodian back out of the room immediately and call for help. Within minutes, police sirens cut through the quiet evening air of Danvers. Officers arrived and secured the building, moving quickly through hallways that were now almost empty, except for a few students finishing late activities. Teachers and staff were questioned. No one had heard anything unusual. No one had seen anything suspicious. The school's security system was reviewed, and footage began to paint a picture that made investigators' stomachs turn. Cameras had captured Colleen staying late in her classroom, as she always did. They captured students leaving the building in clusters and alone. And they captured Philip Chisholm entering the bathroom near Colleen's classroom, carrying a recycling bin, and then emerging minutes later with a large, heavy object inside it. The footage showed him walking calmly through the hallways, pushing the bin as if he were simply doing a chore. No one stopped him. No one questioned why a freshman was moving a bin that size by himself. He exited through a side door that led to the faculty parking lot and disappeared into the woods behind the school. Detectives watched the footage in silence, their faces hardening with each passing second. This was not a crime of passion. This was not a momentary lapse of judgment. This was calculated, deliberate, and disturbingly methodical for someone who was only 14 years old. A search team was immediately dispatched to the wooded area behind the school. Officers spread out with flashlights, calling to each other through the darkness, looking for any sign of what Philip had taken from the building. The search did not take long. They found Colleen's body in a clearing about 50 feet from the edge of the school property. She had been left in the recycling bin, discarded like something disposable, something without value. The officers who discovered her radioed back to command with voices that cracked despite their training. This was not something you got used to, no matter how long you wore a badge. The crime scene was immediately cordoned off, and forensic teams began the painstaking work of documenting everything. Photographs were taken, evidence was collected, measurements were recorded. Every detail mattered because this case would not be simple. A child had taken a life, and the legal system would have to decide how to respond. But first, they had to find Philip Chisholm, and as it turned out, he had not run far. At approximately 12:30 in the morning, a police officer in the nearby town of Topsfield noticed a young man walking along the side of Route 1. It was late, cold, and unusual to see someone that age out alone. The officer pulled over and approached him, asking for identification. The young man said his name was Philip Chisholm. He said he was going to see a movie. At 12:30 in the morning, in a town miles from where he lived, the officer asked him to wait and ran his name through the system. Within seconds, alerts lit up the screen. This was the boy everyone was looking for. Philip was taken into custody without resistance. He did not ask why he was being arrested. He did not seem surprised. He simply got into the back of the patrol car and stared out the window as if he were on his way to something mundane. Back at the police station, detectives prepared for an interrogation that would reveal just how little remorse Philip felt. His clothes were covered in blood. His hands bore scratches and marks consistent with a violent struggle. And yet when they sat him down in the interview room and read him his rights, he nodded calmly and said he understood. They asked him where he had been. He said he went for a walk. They asked him about Colleen Ritzer. He said she was his teacher. They asked him what happened in room 229. And Philip leaned back in his chair, looked directly at the detectives, and began to tell a story that was equal parts confession and deflection. He admitted he had been in the classroom. He admitted there had been a confrontation, but he framed it in a way that suggested he was not entirely responsible, that something had triggered him, that he had not been in full control. The detectives listened without interrupting, taking notes, watching his body language. What struck them most was not what he said. It was how he said it. There was no tremor in his voice, no tears, no visible distress. He could have been describing a scene from a movie instead of a crime he had committed. As the sun rose over Danvers the next morning, news of Colleen's death spread through the community like wildfire. Parents woke their children early to tell them before they heard it at school. Students gathered in small groups, crying, hugging, unable to process the fact that a teacher they had seen just yesterday was gone. The school remained closed while investigators continued processing the crime scene. Counselors were brought in to help students and staff who were struggling, and in a holding cell miles away, Philip Chisholm lay on a thin mattress and stared at the ceiling, showing no sign that he understood the magnitude of what he had done. The investigation was only beginning. The trial would take years, but the crime itself was already complete, and nothing would ever bring Colleen Ritzer back. The interrogation room was small and deliberately uncomfortable, designed to make people talk even when they didn't want to. A metal table bolted to the floor sat in the center, 2 chairs on one side for detectives and one on the other for suspects. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile white glow that made everyone look pale and exhausted. Philip Chisholm sat in the suspect's chair, still wearing the blood-stained clothes he had been arrested in. His hands rested on the table, fingernails crusted with dried blood, that forensic teams would later match to Colleen Ritzer. 2 detectives sat across from him, notebooks open, pens ready. One was older, a veteran investigator with 30 years of experience who had seen more than his share of terrible things. The other was younger, sharper, better at reading the subtle shifts in body language that gave away lies. Together, they made a formidable team, but neither of them had ever interrogated someone quite like Philip. The older detective started with easy questions, the kind designed to establish rapport and baseline behavior. What was Philip's full name? When was his birthday? How long had he been living in Massachusetts? Philip answered each question clearly and without hesitation. His voice was steady, almost monotone, as if he were filling out a routine form instead of sitting in a police station after being arrested for something unthinkable. The detective asked about school. Did Philip like Danvers High? Did he have friends there? How were his grades? Philip said school was fine. He said he didn't have many friends yet because he was new. He said his grades were okay, not great, but okay. Everything about his demeanor suggested a normal teenager having a normal conversation, except for the blood under his fingernails, except for the fact that his teacher was dead. The younger detective leaned forward and shifted the tone. He asked Philip to walk them through his day on October 22nd, every detail from the moment he woke up to the moment he was arrested. Philip nodded and began. He said he woke up around 6:30, ate breakfast, and took the bus to school. He said his morning classes were boring. He said he ate lunch alone in the cafeteria. He said his afternoon math class with Miss Ritzer was normal, nothing unusual happened, and then he paused. The detectives waited, letting the silence stretch. Philip shifted slightly in his seat and continued. He said that after the final bell rang, he stayed behind because he had a question about the homework. He said Miss Ritzer was nice about it and offered to help. He said they talked for a few minutes and then he left. He said he walked out of the school, through the parking lot, and started walking toward Route 1 because he wanted to see a movie. The older detective nodded slowly and flipped a page in his notebook. He asked Philip what movie he wanted to see. Philip hesitated for the first time, his eyes flickering toward the wall before returning to the detective's face. He said he didn't remember the title. He just wanted to see something. The detective asked what theater he was planning to go to. Philip said he wasn't sure. He was just walking and figured he would find one. The detective pointed out that the nearest theater was more than 5 miles away, and it was after midnight when Philip was picked up. Did he really think he would make it there on foot in the middle of the night? Philip shrugged and said he wasn't thinking clearly. He said he was upset about something and just needed to walk. The detective asked what he was upset about. Philip said he didn't know. Just teenage stuff, nothing specific. The younger detective pulled out a folder and opened it slowly, making sure Philip could see the contents. Inside were still images from the school's security cameras. Frame by frame, they showed Philip entering the bathroom with a recycling bin. They showed him emerging with something large and heavy inside it. They showed him pushing the bin through the hallways and out the side door. The detective slid the images across the table one at a time, watching Philip's face for any reaction. There was none. Philip looked at each image as if he were examining someone else's photographs. The detective asked him to explain what was in the bin. Philip said he didn't remember. The detective asked again, more firmly this time. Philip repeated that he didn't remember. His tone never changed. His expression remained blank. It was as if his mind had compartmentalized the entire event, locked it away somewhere he could not or would not access. The older detective stood up and walked around the table, positioning himself behind Philip. He spoke quietly, almost gently, asking Philip if he understood how serious this situation was. He explained that they already had evidence, that lying would only make things worse, that cooperation was the only smart choice right now. Philip nodded but said nothing. The detective asked him directly if he had harmed Colleen Ritzer. Philip was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the table. Then he said yes. He said it simply, without emotion, as if confirming a fact rather than admitting to something devastating. The detectives exchanged a glance. This was not how confessions usually went. There was no breakdown, no tears, no desperate attempt to explain or justify, just a flat acknowledgement followed by more silence. The younger detective asked Philip why he did it. This was the question that mattered most, the one that would help prosecutors build a case and help a jury understand motive. Philip looked up at the detective and said he didn't know. He said Miss Ritzer made a comment about Tennessee and it upset him. He said something inside him snapped and he couldn't control it. The detectives pressed for more details. What exactly did she say? How did the confrontation start? What happened after? Philip's answers became vague and contradictory. He said she was standing by the door. Then he said she was by the desk. He said it happened quickly. Then he said it lasted a while. He said he didn't plan it. But the security footage showed him bringing materials into the classroom beforehand. Every piece of his story had holes, and the detectives noted each one carefully. By the time the interrogation ended, the sun was rising outside. Philip was taken to a holding cell where he would wait for arraignment. The detectives compiled their notes and reviewed the footage again. One thing was abundantly clear. Philip Chisholm was lying, not just to them, but possibly to himself. He had constructed a version of events that minimized his responsibility, that framed him as a victim of his own emotions rather than the architect of a calculated crime. But the evidence told a different story, a story of premeditation, of deliberate choices, of a young man who knew exactly what he was doing and did it anyway. The detectives forwarded their findings to the district attorney's office with a single recommendation: charge him as an adult. Because whatever Philip believed about himself, the facts painted a picture of someone who understood right from wrong and chose wrong anyway. And that, the detectives knew, was the definition of responsibility. In the days following Philip's arrest, investigators began piecing together a portrait of a teenager whose inner life was far darker than anyone had realized. They seized his computer, his phone, and his personal belongings, searching for clues that might explain why a 14-year-old would commit such a devastating act. What they found was disturbing not because it was overtly violent or shocking, but because it revealed a pattern of thinking that suggested Philip had spent months, perhaps longer, constructing a reality in which he existed outside the rules that governed everyone else. His search history showed an obsession with criminal cases, particularly those involving young offenders who had received minimal sentences. He had researched juvenile justice extensively, reading articles articles about sentencing guidelines and rehabilitation programs. He had visited forums where people debated whether children could truly be held accountable for serious crimes. He knew the system, and he believed it would protect him. His text messages told another story, one of isolation and festering resentment. He had moved to Massachusetts from Tennessee just 2 months before Colleen's death, leaving behind friends and familiar surroundings. His messages to former classmates revealed a boy who felt displaced, angry, and increasingly disconnected from reality. He complained that people in Massachusetts were unfriendly. He said teachers didn't understand him. He wrote long, rambling paragraphs about how no one appreciated how smart he was, how different he was from everyone around him. His friends back in Tennessee tried to reassure him, telling him to give it time, to make an effort. But Philip's responses grew shorter and colder. In one message sent just 3 days before the crime, he wrote that he was tired of pretending to care about things that didn't matter. When asked what he meant, he didn't reply. Psychologists brought in to evaluate Philip used terms like narcissistic traits and emotional detachment. They explained that adolescent brains are still developing, particularly the prefrontal cortex responsible for impulse control and understanding consequences. But they also noted that Philip's behavior went beyond typical teenage impulsivity. He demonstrated an ability to plan, to deceive, and to carry out a complex series of actions without visible distress. He had hidden evidence. He had altered his appearance. He had lied to investigators with a calm that suggested practice rather than panic. One psychologist noted in her report that Philip seemed to view himself as the protagonist in a story where other people were merely supporting characters, their lives less significant than his own narrative. This was not immaturity. This was something colder, something that raised uncomfortable questions about whether some people, regardless of age, simply lacked the fundamental capacity for empathy. His digital footprint also revealed a troubling fascination with control. He had saved articles about manipulation tactics, about how to read people and influence their behavior. He had watched videos on body language and interrogation techniques. He had bookmarked pages about famous criminals who had evaded justice or received light sentences due to their age. It painted a picture of someone who was not impulsively violent, but rather methodically curious about the mechanics of crime and punishment. He wanted to know what he could get away with. He wanted to test boundaries. And Colleen Ritzer, kind and patient and willing to stay late to help a struggling student, had become the target of that test. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because she was available, because she was vulnerable, because Philip had decided that his curiosity mattered more than her life. What made Philip's mindset particularly chilling was his apparent belief that consequences were negotiable. In recovered notes found in his backpack, he had written lists of excuses and justifications, things he could say if questioned, ways to frame himself as a victim rather than an aggressor. He had practiced his story, workshopped it, refined it until it sounded plausible. He wrote that people would feel sorry for him because he was young and had been through a difficult move. He wrote that his age would work in his favor, that adults always wanted to believe children could be redeemed. He wrote in handwriting that was careful and deliberate that the system was designed to give second chances to people like him. He believed, truly believed, that he was untouchable, that the rules applying to adults simply did not apply to him because he was 14 and therefore still somehow innocent in the eyes of the law. Experts who reviewed the case debated whether Philip met the criteria for sociopathy. The term is controversial, especially when applied to minors, because personality disorders are typically not diagnosed until adulthood, but certain markers were undeniable: lack of remorse, superficial charm, and ability to mimic appropriate emotions without actually feeling them. During his interrogation, Philip had said the right words at certain moments, expressing what sounded like regret, but his body language never matched. His eyes remained flat. His breathing stayed steady. He performed sadness the way an actor might, hitting the notes but missing the music. Detectives who had spent decades interviewing criminals said they had rarely seen someone so young display such pronounced emotional emptiness. It was as if the part of him that should have been horrified by what he had done simply didn't exist. The community struggled to reconcile the evidence with the image of a boy who looked so ordinary. Philip had no history of violence. He had never been arrested before. Teachers described him as quiet but not threatening, withdrawn but not hostile. His mother, devastated devastated by the arrest, insisted that her son was a good kid who had made a terrible mistake. She spoke about his difficult adjustment to the move, about family stresses he had been dealing with, about how he just needed help and support. But investigators reviewing the timeline found no sudden trigger, no dramatic event that explained the crime. Philip had not snapped in a moment of rage. He had made a series of calculated decisions over the course of an hour, each one moving him closer to an outcome he had already envisioned, and when it was done, he had walked away without looking back, his mind already shifting to the next phase of his plan: survive the interrogation, minimize the damage, let his age do the heavy lifting. But there was one thing Philip had not accounted for, one variable he had not fully researched or understood. The judge who would eventually preside over his case, David Lowy, had spent years on the bench watching young offenders cycle through the system. He had seen genuine remorse, and he had seen calculated performance. He had granted leniency to those who deserved it and imposed harsh sentences on those who needed them, and he had developed an ability to see past the surface, to recognize when someone was playing a role rather than experiencing genuine transformation. Philip believed his age would save him, but Judge Lowy understood something Philip did not: that justice was not about age, it was about accountability, and accountability required acknowledging the weight of what had been done. Philip had shown no such acknowledgement, and that would matter more than anything else when the time came to decide his fate. The news of Colleen Ritzer's death hit Danvers like a physical blow. It was the kind of tragedy that shattered the illusion of safety in a small town where violent crime was supposed to happen somewhere else, to someone else. Within hours of the discovery, local news stations began broadcasting updates, their reporters standing outside the high school with grim expressions, describing what little they were allowed to share. By evening, national networks had picked up the story: a beloved teacher, a 14-year-old suspect, a crime so shocking that even seasoned journalists struggled to report it without visible emotion. Parents across the country watched the coverage and felt their stomachs turn, imagining their own children in classrooms that suddenly felt less safe than they had the day before. Danvers High School remained closed for the rest of the week. The building that had once hummed with the energy of teenagers laughing and learning now stood silent, surrounded by police tape and television cameras. Administrators worked with grief counselors to prepare for the eventual reopening, knowing that students and staff would return traumatized and searching for answers that didn't exist. On Thursday evening, 3 days after Colleen's death, the town organized a candlelight vigil in the high school parking lot. Hundreds of people showed up, many of them clutching flowers or photographs of Colleen. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the October cold, their breath forming clouds in the dim light, and they cried. Some spoke about how Colleen had changed their lives. Others simply held candles and tried to process the impossible reality that someone so young and full of promise was gone. But as grief rippled through the community, so did something darker: anger, the kind of anger that comes from feeling violated, from having innocence stripped away without permission. People wanted someone to blame, and Philip Chisholm became the focus of a rage that grew more intense with each passing day. On social media, parents and students posted messages demanding justice, calling for Philip to be tried as an adult, insisting that age should not protect someone who had committed such a calculated act. Some comments were measured and thoughtful. Others were venomous, crossing lines into language that suggested revenge rather than accountability. The district attorney's office received hundreds of calls and emails, most of them urging prosecutors to pursue the harshest possible charges. The message was clear: the community wanted Philip to pay. Not everyone agreed. A smaller but vocal group argued that Philip was still a child, that his brain was not fully developed, that the justice system existed to rehabilitate rather than punish. They pointed to research on adolescent psychology, to studies showing that teenagers are more impulsive and less capable of understanding long-term consequences. They argued that sending a 14-year-old to adult prison was cruel and ineffective, that it would destroy any chance he had at becoming a functional member of society. These voices were drowned out by the majority, but they persisted, showing up at town hall meetings and writing op-eds in local newspapers. The debate split families and friendships. People who had known each other for years found themselves on opposite sides of a question that felt too big and too painful to answer. What do you do with a child who has done something unforgivable? Colleen's family released a brief statement through their attorney. They asked for privacy as they mourned. They thanked the community for its support, and they said, in language that was simple and devastating, that Colleen had dedicated her life to helping young people, and they hoped her death would not be used used to fuel hatred or division. The statement was read aloud at the vigil, and for a moment the crowd fell silent, absorbing the grace of a family that had every right to demand vengeance but chose instead to honor their daughter's values. It was a moment of collective reflection, a reminder that tragedy could either destroy a community or reveal its capacity for compassion. But the moment passed quickly. The anger returned, the calls for justice grew louder, and prosecutors, feeling the weight of public expectation, began building a case that would treat Philip Chisholm not as a misguided child, but as someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Behind the scenes, the legal machinery moved forward. The district attorney convened a grand jury to review the evidence and determine whether Philip should be charged as an adult. Under Massachusetts law, juveniles aged 14 or older could be tried in adult court for certain serious offenses, but the decision required careful consideration of multiple factors: the nature of the crime, the defendant's maturity level, the likelihood of rehabilitation, the need to protect the public. Prosecutors presented forensic evidence, witness testimony, and excerpts from Philip's interrogation. They showed the grand jury footage of Philip calmly moving through the school after the crime, demonstrating no signs of panic or regret. They played audio recordings of him speaking to detectives, his voice flat and emotionless as he described what he had done. The grand jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Their decision was unanimous. Philip Chisholm would be charged as an adult. The announcement sent shockwaves through both sides of the debate. Supporters of the decision applauded the district attorney's courage, saying it sent a clear message that heinous crimes would not be excused regardless of the perpetrator's age. Opponents decried it as a failure of the justice system, arguing that society had given up on a child before giving him a chance to change. Legal experts weighed in on television news programs, debating whether the decision was legally sound and morally justifiable. Some pointed to similar cases where young offenders had been successfully rehabilitated. Others cited statistics showing high recidivism rates among violent juvenile offenders. The conversation was complex and nuanced, but it was also deeply personal. Everyone watching had their own beliefs about childhood, responsibility, and whether people could truly change. And Philip, sitting in a juvenile detention facility awaiting trial, remained at the center of it all, his fate now in the hands of a system he had once believed he could manipulate. Colleen's classroom remained untouched for weeks. School administrators could not bring themselves to clear it out, to remove the posters and the student artwork and the carefully organized bookshelves. Eventually, with the family's permission, they transformed it into a memorial space. Students and teachers left notes and flowers. They wrote letters to Colleen, telling her things they had never said when she was alive. They apologized for not paying attention in class. They thanked her for believing in them when no one else did. They promised to work harder, to be kinder, to live in ways that honored her memory. The room became sacred, a place to grieve and remember and find some small measure of comfort. And every person who walked through that door left with the same thought, that Colleen Ritzer deserved so much more than the ending she received, and that the boy who took her life would have to answer for it in ways that no amount of age or excuses could diminish. The Essex County Superior Courthouse sat in the center of Salem, Massachusetts, the imposing granite building with columns that spoke of tradition and authority. On a cold morning in December, 2 months after Colleen's death, a crowd began gathering outside long before the doors opened. Reporters jostled for position on the courthouse steps, their camera crews setting up tripods and checking equipment. Spectators lined up behind metal barricades, some holding signs demanding justice, others praying quietly with rosaries clutched in their hands. Security was tight. Extra bailiffs had been called in. Police officers monitored the crowd, watching for any sign that emotions might boil over into something more dangerous. This was not just another arraignment. This was the moment when a community would see the boy who had shattered their sense of safety, and everyone wanted to be there when it happened. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense and formal. The courtroom itself was older, with high ceilings and dark wood paneling that gave it a somber dignity. Rows of benches filled. Quickly as people filed in, their conversations hushed and careful. Colleen's family sat in the front row behind the prosecutor, prosecution table, her mother flanked by relatives who held her hands and whispered words of support. Her father stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his eyes red from weeks of sleepless nights. Across the aisle, the defense table remained empty, except for two attorneys who shuffled papers and spoke in low tones. They knew what was coming. They knew their client would be the most hated person in the room, and they knew their job was to defend him anyway, to ensure his constitutional rights were protected, even if every instinct told them he didn't deserve protection. At precisely 9:30, a door at the side of the courtroom opened, and Philip Chisholm was led inside. He was dressed in a dark suit that looked slightly too large for his frame, making him appear even younger than he was. His hands were cuffed in front of him, the chain clinking softly with each step. A bailiff guided him to the defense table, and Philip sat down between his attorneys without looking at the gallery. But everyone in the room was looking at him, studying his face, searching for some sign of remorse or fear or humanity. What they saw instead was the same blank expression he had worn during his interrogation. He glanced around the courtroom once, his eyes passing over Colleen's family without pausing, without flinching, without any visible recognition of the pain his actions had caused. And then he looked down at the table, his fingers drumming lightly against the wood, as if he were bored. Judge David Lowy entered through a door behind the bench, and everyone rose. He was a tall man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, his black robes hanging with a weight that seemed to embody the seriousness of the moment. He took his seat, surveyed the courtroom, and gestured for everyone to sit. The clerk called the case. Commonwealth versus Philip Chisholm. The charges were read aloud in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. First-degree murder, aggravated assault, robbery. Each charge was followed by a brief description of the alleged acts, clinical and factual, stripped of emotion but heavy with implication. As the clerk spoke, Colleen's mother closed her eyes and pressed a tissue to her face. Her shoulders shook silently. Her husband placed his arm around her, holding her steady as the words continued. Philip sat motionless, his expression unchanged. When the reading of charges concluded, Judge Lowy addressed Philip directly. He asked if Philip understood the charges against him. Philip stood slowly, his chains rattling, and said yes in a voice that was quiet but clear. The judge asked if he understood his rights. Philip said yes again. There was no tremor, no hesitation, nothing to suggest the magnitude of what was happening. He could have been answering questions in a classroom instead of standing in a courtroom facing the possibility of life in prison. The judge studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then nodded to the prosecution. The assistant district attorney rose, a woman in her 40s with a reputation for being thorough and uncompromising. She addressed the court, outlining the evidence the state intended to present at trial: security footage, forensic analysis, witness testimony, a confession. Each piece of evidence was devastating on its own. Together they formed a narrative so airtight that even the defense knew challenging it would be nearly impossible. The defense attorney stood and argued that Philip should remain in juvenile detention rather than adult jail while awaiting trial. He cited his client's age, his lack of prior criminal history, his right to education, and developmentally appropriate care. The prosecutor objected immediately, pointing out the severity of the crime and the calculated nature of Philip's actions. She reminded the court that Philip had fled the scene, hidden evidence, and lied to investigators. She argued that treating him as a juvenile would send the wrong message and endanger public safety. Judge Lowy listened to both sides without interrupting, his fingers steepled under his chin. When both attorneys finished, he made his ruling. Philip would be held in a secure juvenile facility with provisions for adult supervision. It was a compromise that satisfied no one, but maintained the appearance of fairness. The defense had hoped for more lenient conditions. The prosecution had wanted him in adult lockup immediately. Both would have to wait for trial to get what they truly wanted. As the hearing moved toward its conclusion, Judge Lowy made a statement that silenced the room. He looked directly at Philip and said that the court expected appropriate conduct at all times. He said that this was a serious proceeding, that lives had been irrevocably damaged, and that any display of disrespect or indifference would be noted and remembered. He said it calmly without raising his voice, but the message was unmistakable. The judge was watching, and he was not impressed by what he saw. Philip nodded, but as he did, something flickered across his face, a brief tightening at the corner of his mouth, a slight narrowing of his eyes. It lasted only a second, but several people in the gallery noticed it. It looked unmistakably like irritation, as if Philip found the judge's warning tedious, as if he resented being lectured. The moment passed quickly, and Philip returned to his blank expression. But Judge Lowy had seen it too, and he filed it away in his memory. One more piece of evidence that the boy standing before him felt no genuine understanding of the gravity of his situation. The arraignment concluded, and Philip was led back through the side door. The gallery erupted in a murmur of voices as people processed what they had just witnessed. Some were satisfied that he had been charged as an adult. Others were disturbed by how young he looked, how small and ordinary. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the attorneys for comment. The prosecution expressed confidence in their case. The defense urged the public to remember that Philip was entitled to a fair trial and the presumption of innocence. But the presumption of innocence felt hollow to the crowd gathered on the courthouse steps. They had seen the evidence, they had heard the charges, and they had watched Philip sit through it all with an expression that suggested he believed none of it really mattered, that somehow, despite everything, he would find a way to escape the consequences. What no one knew yet was that Judge Lowy had already begun forming an opinion, not about Philip's guilt, that would be determined by a jury, but about his character. And when the time came to impose a sentence, that opinion would matter more than Philip could possibly imagine. The trial began on a gray morning in late fall, nearly 2 years after Colleen Ritzer's death. The delay had been necessary to allow both sides time to prepare, to review mountains of evidence, to depose witnesses, and to navigate the complex legal questions surrounding a juvenile being tried as an adult. During those 2 years, public interest had not waned. If anything, it had intensified. The case had become a national touchstone for debates about youth violence, criminal responsibility, and whether the justice system was equipped to handle defendants who looked like children but acted with adult calculation. By the time jury selection concluded and opening statements began, the courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and members of the community who had waited months for a chance to attend. Colleen's family sat in their familiar spot, older now, worn down by grief but determined to see the process through to its end. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by the same assistant district attorney who had argued at the arraignment. She stood before the jury, 12 men and women who had sworn to set aside any preconceptions and judge the case solely on evidence, and she told them a story, not a story designed to manipulate or inflame, but a straightforward recounting of facts that needed no embellishment. She described Colleen Ritzer as a teacher who stayed late to help students, who gave freely of her time and energy, who believed in second chances and the fundamental goodness of young people. She described October 22nd as an ordinary day that ended in extraordinary tragedy. And then she described Philip Chisholm, a 14-year-old who had researched the juvenile justice system, who had planned his actions carefully, and who had shown no remorse when confronted with what he had done. She promised the jury that the evidence would be overwhelming, that there would be no doubt about who committed this crime or how it unfolded, and she asked them to remember one simple truth, that accountability is not determined by age, it is determined by choices. The defense attorney's opening statement took a different approach. He acknowledged that Philip had committed a terrible act, that there was no disputing the basic facts of the case, but he urged the jury to consider context. He spoke about adolescent brain development, about how the prefrontal cortex responsible for impulse control and judgment is not fully formed until the mid-20s. He described Philip's difficult transition from Tennessee to Massachusetts, the social isolation he experienced, the stresses he faced at home. He did not excuse what Philip had done, but he asked the jury to see him as a troubled child who made a catastrophic mistake rather than a calculating criminal who deserved adult punishment. He reminded them that the law recognizes differences between juveniles and adults for a reason, that children are more capable of change and rehabilitation, and he asked them to keep an open mind as the evidence was presented, to remember that Philip was still a human being worthy of compassion despite the horror of his actions. The first week of trial was consumed by forensic evidence. A parade of experts took the stand, each one adding another piece to a puzzle that was already disturbingly clear. A crime scene investigator described the condition of Colleen's classroom, the evidence of a violent struggle, the blood spatter patterns that told a story of desperation and resistance. A medical examiner testified about the cause of death, describing injuries in clinical terms that still managed to convey the brutality of what had occurred. The jury listened in silence, silence, some taking notes, others staring straight ahead with expressions that suggested they were struggling to maintain composure. Colleen's mother left the courtroom during the medical examiner's testimony, unable to hear the details of her daughter's final moments. Her husband stayed, his face a mask of controlled anguish, determined to bear witness even when it hurt beyond measure. The security footage was played next, and it was this evidence more than any other that demolished any remaining doubt about Philip's guilt. The jury watched as cameras captured Philip entering the bathroom with a recycling bin, emerging minutes later with something heavy inside, and calmly pushing it through empty hallways. They watched him exit the building and disappear into the woods. The timestamp in the corner of the screen showed it was just after 3:30 in the afternoon. School had been dismissed less than an hour earlier. While other students were going home or heading to after-school activities, Philip was disposing of evidence with a methodical precision that belied his age. The footage played in complete silence. No one in the courtroom spoke. No one coughed or shifted in their seats. They simply watched, and the weight of what they were seeing pressed down on everyone present. A forensic computer analyst testified about Philip's digital footprint. The jury learned about his searches related to juvenile sentencing, about the articles he had bookmarked, about the forums he had visited where people discussed whether children could truly be held accountable for serious crimes. The analyst explained that these searches had occurred in the weeks leading up to Colleen's death, suggesting premeditation rather than impulsive action. The defense objected, arguing that curiosity about the legal system did not prove intent to commit a crime. The judge sustained some objections and overruled others, but the damage was done. The jury had seen enough to understand that Philip had not simply snapped in a moment of rage. He had thought about this. He had prepared. He had believed he knew how the system would respond. Text messages between Philip and former friends were read aloud. Messages where he complained about feeling disconnected and misunderstood. Messages where he expressed frustration with teachers and classmates. And one message, sent just days before the crime, where he told a friend that he was tired of pretending everything was fine. The friend had responded with encouragement, telling Philip to hang in there, that things would get better. Philip never replied. The friend, now testifying via video link, broke down when asked to read that final exchange. She said she had replayed the conversation 1,000 times, wondering if there was something she could have said differently, some way she could have known that Philip was planning something terrible. The prosecution gently reminded her that she bore no responsibility, that Philip's actions were his alone. But the guilt on her face suggested she would carry that weight for the rest of her life. The most damaging evidence came near the end of the prosecution's case. Audio recordings from Philip's police interrogation were played for the jury. They heard his calm, measured voice as he described being in Colleen's classroom. They heard him admit to the crime while simultaneously trying to minimize his responsibility. They heard him claim he couldn't control himself, that something had triggered him. But they also heard him describe actions that required sustained effort and clear thinking. The contradiction was stark. Philip wanted to be seen as both a victim of his own impulses and a rational person capable of explaining his behavior. The two narratives could not coexist, and as the recordings played, several jurors glanced at the defense table where Philip sat. He was staring down at his hands, his face expressionless, showing no visible reaction to hearing his own voice describe something so devastating. That lack of reaction spoke louder than any testimony. It suggested someone who had compartmentalized the crime so thoroughly that he could discuss it as if it had happened to someone else. By the time the prosecution rested its case, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. What had begun as a trial was starting to feel more like a formality. The evidence was overwhelming. The defense had no credible way to challenge the basic facts. Their only hope was to argue mitigation, to convince the jury that Philip's age should matter more than his actions. But even that argument felt increasingly hollow in the face of such meticulous planning and such complete absence of remorse. Judge Lowy called a recess, and as people filed out of the courtroom, the consensus was clear. Philip Chisholm would be convicted. The only question remaining was what would happen after the verdict was read, and that question would not be answered by the jury. It would be answered by the judge, a judge who had spent weeks watching Philip sit through testimony about the life he had taken and who had not once seen him show genuine emotion. That observation would matter, and and soon Philip would understand just how much. The defense began presenting its case on a Monday morning, and from the opening witness it was clear their strategy would focus entirely on Philip's age and mental state. They called a developmental psychologist who testified about adolescent brain development, explaining in careful detail how the teenage brain is fundamentally different from an adult brain. She spoke about the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for impulse control and understanding consequences, and how it continues developing well into a person's 20s. She showed the jury brain scans comparing adolescent and adult neural activity, pointing out areas that light up differently when making decisions. Her testimony was scientifically sound and well presented, but it was also abstract, disconnected from the specifics of this case, and the jury seemed to recognize that. They listened politely, took notes, but their expressions suggested they were waiting for something more concrete, more relevant to the boy sitting at the defense table. The defense called a social worker who had evaluated Philip during his time in juvenile detention. She testified that he had been cooperative, that he participated in educational programs, that he showed capacity for growth and change. She described sessions where Philip had discussed his difficult adjustment to Massachusetts, his feelings of isolation, his struggles with anger management. She painted a picture of a troubled teenager who needed help rather than punishment, who could be rehabilitated if given the proper support and structure. But during cross-examination, the prosecution asked pointed questions. Had Philip ever expressed genuine remorse for what he did to Colleen Ritzer? The social worker hesitated before answering. She said he had expressed regret in general terms. The prosecutor pressed harder. Had he ever, in any of their sessions, talked about Colleen as a person rather than as a victim in his story? The social worker admitted that he had not. Had he ever asked about her family, wondered about their pain, shown concern for anyone other than himself? The social worker's silence was answer enough. The defense's psychiatric expert testified next, a doctor who had spent hours evaluating Philip and reviewing his history. He diagnosed Philip with adjustment disorder and depressive symptoms related to his move and family stressors. He explained that these conditions could impair judgment and emotional regulation, making impulsive behavior more likely. He stopped short of saying Philip couldn't control his actions because the evidence made that claim impossible to defend, but he suggested that Philip's mental state at the time of the crime was compromised. During cross-examination, the prosecutor methodically dismantled this narrative. She asked about the security footage showing Philip calmly moving through the school after the crime. She asked about the premeditated searches on his computer. She asked about his ability to lie coherently to detectives for hours. Did those actions suggest someone who couldn't control himself? The doctor acknowledged they suggested planning and awareness. The prosecutor nodded and sat down, her point made. Then came the moment that changed everything. The defense called Philip's mother to testify. She walked to the witness stand with her head down, her hands clasped tightly together, her entire body radiating the kind of grief that comes from loving someone who has done something unforgivable. She spoke about Philip's childhood, about how he had been a quiet, sensitive boy who loved drawing and playing video games. She described the difficulty of the move to Massachusetts, how Philip had struggled to make friends and adjust to a new school. She talked about arguments they had at home, typical parent-teenager conflicts that now felt loaded with terrible significance. And then she began to cry, not quietly, but with deep, shaking sobs that echoed through the courtroom. She said she didn't understand how this had happened. She said she kept replaying every conversation, every decision, wondering what she could have done differently. She said she was sorry, so desperately sorry, to Colleen's family for failing to see the warning signs in her own son. Philip, who had remained impassive through weeks of testimony, suddenly shifted in his seat. His jaw tightened, his hands curled into fists on the table, and when his mother looked directly at him and said through tears that she still loved him but couldn't comprehend what he had done, Philip's face transformed. The blank mask he had worn so carefully slipped away, replaced by something raw and ugly. He leaned toward his attorney and whispered something sharp and angry. The attorney tried to calm him, placing a hand on his arm, but Philip jerked away. The judge noticed immediately. Judge Lowy leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the defense table, watching as Philip struggled to regain composure. The moment lasted only seconds, but it was enough. The jury had seen it. The gallery had seen it. And most importantly, the judge had seen it. The careful facade Philip had maintained had cracked, revealing what lay beneath. Not remorse or sorrow or even fear, just anger. anger that his mother had dared to speak the truth. The prosecution did not cross-examine Philip's mother. There was no need. Her testimony had humanized her as a grieving parent, but it had also inadvertently highlighted Philip's capacity for manipulation and his inability to accept responsibility. After she stepped down, the defense rested its case. They had done what they could with limited options, but everyone in the courtroom understood it had not been enough. The judge called for closing arguments to begin the following day, and court was adjourned. As people filed out, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. The trial was nearly over. The verdict seemed inevitable. What remained was the question of consequences, and that question hung over everything like a weight waiting to fall. That evening, legal analysts on television debated what they had witnessed. Some argued that Philip's outburst proved he was still an immature teenager incapable of controlling his emotions. Others said it proved the opposite, that his anger at being exposed revealed a narcissistic personality more concerned with image than accountability. The debate would continue for weeks, but inside the courthouse, the people who mattered most had already formed their opinions. The jury had seen enough to understand that Philip Chisholm was not a victim of circumstance or underdeveloped neurology. He was someone who had made deliberate choices and then worked hard to avoid facing the consequences. Colleen's family sat together that night, holding each other, knowing that the trial was almost finished, but the pain would never truly end. And Judge Lowy sat in his chambers, reviewing notes, preparing for what would come next. He had presided over this trial with fairness and patience. He had ensured Philip received every protection the law afforded him, but he had also watched Philip closely, day after day, looking for some sign that the boy understood the magnitude of what he had done. And he had seen nothing except that brief flash of anger when his own mother told the truth. That moment told Judge Lowy everything he needed to know, and it would inform every decision he made going forward. The next morning, closing arguments began. The prosecution summarized the evidence with devastating efficiency. They reminded the jury of the security footage, the forensic analysis, the confession, the complete absence of any mitigating factor that could explain or justify what Philip had done. They asked the jury to hold Philip accountable, not despite his age, but because accountability is what separates a functioning society from chaos. They said that Colleen Ritzer deserved justice, and justice required acknowledging that some crimes are so serious that age becomes irrelevant. The defense made their final appeal for compassion, asking the jury to remember that Philip was a child, that children make mistakes, that the purpose of the justice system should be rehabilitation rather than retribution. They urged the jury not to give up on a 14-year-old, not to consign him to a life without hope. It was a passionate argument, delivered with genuine conviction, but it could not overcome the weight of evidence or the memory of Philip's blank expression throughout weeks of testimony about a woman who had done nothing wrong except try to help him. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the forepersons stood and read the verdict. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, aggravated assault, robbery. The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread through the courtroom and beyond. Colleen's family held each other and wept with relief and continued grief. Philip sat motionless, his face once again blank, but his hands trembling slightly on the table. The judge thanked the jury for their service and scheduled a sentencing hearing for 6 weeks later. As Philip was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he glanced back once at the gallery, not at his mother, who was crying quietly in the back row, not at Colleen's family, who had endured weeks of painful testimony. He looked at the reporters, at the cameras, at the people who had watched his trial with such intensity, and for just a second, that faint smirk returned, as if even now, even after being convicted, he still believed that somehow this wasn't really happening to him, that somehow he would find a way out. He had no idea that the hardest part was still to come, and that the judge who had watched him so carefully had already decided exactly what justice would look like. The weeks between the verdict and sentencing were the longest of Peggy Ritzer's life. She had already endured 2 years of waiting, of watching her daughter's death dissected in courtrooms and analyzed on television, of waking up every morning and remembering all over again that Colleen was gone. The guilty verdict had brought a measure of relief, confirmation that the world recognized the injustice of what had been taken from her family. But it did not bring peace. Nothing could do that. Peace required a world where Colleen was still alive, still teaching, still lighting up rooms with her kindness and patience. That world no longer existed. All that remained was the painful work of finding some way to move forward while carrying a grief grief that would never fully heal. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for December, just weeks before what would have been Colleen's 27th birthday. The judge had granted the family an opportunity to deliver victim impact statements, a chance to speak directly to Philip and to the court about what had been stolen from them. Peggy knew she wanted to speak, needed to speak, but the thought of standing in front of the boy who had murdered her daughter and finding words adequate to express that loss felt impossible. How do you quantify the absence of someone you loved more than your own life? How do you explain to a courtroom full of strangers what it means to wake up every day knowing your child suffered in her final moments and you were not there to protect her? How do you make a 14-year-old understand the permanence of death when he had spent 2 years demonstrating that he didn't care? Peggy sat at her kitchen table with a blank notebook in front of her, trying to write. She started and stopped dozens of times, crumpling pages and throwing them away, frustrated by the inadequacy of language. Words felt too small for the magnitude of what she needed to say. But eventually, slowly, something began to take shape. She wrote about Colleen as a little girl, curious and bright, always asking questions and wanting to understand how things worked. She wrote about Colleen as a teenager, kind even when kindness wasn't popular, standing up for classmates who were bullied or left out. She wrote about Colleen as a young woman choosing teaching as a profession, despite knowing the pay was low and the challenges were many, because she genuinely believed she could make a difference in young people's lives. And she wrote about the empty chair at their Thanksgiving table, the birthday that would never be celebrated, the grandchildren that would never exist. She wrote until her hand cramped and her eyes burned with tears, and when she finished, she knew it still wasn't enough, but it was all she had to give. Colleen's father, Tom, decided he could not speak at the hearing. The anger he carried was too raw, too close to the surface, and he worried that if he started talking he would say things he would regret, things that would make him look vengeful rather than grieving. He wanted Philip to receive the harshest possible sentence, but he also knew that his daughter would not have wanted her memory associated with hatred. Colleen had believed in rehabilitation, in second chances, in the fundamental capacity of people to change. She had chosen to work with teenagers precisely because she believed they were still forming, still capable of growth. Tom struggled with that legacy. How could he honor his daughter's values while also demanding justice for her death? The contradiction tore at him daily. He settled on writing a letter that would be submitted to the court but not read aloud, a letter that expressed his pain without demanding specific punishment. He left that decision to the judge, trusting that the man who had presided over the trial with such careful attention would understand what needed to happen. Colleen's younger sister, Laura, chose to speak. She was 21 now, a college student trying to build a life while carrying the weight of her sister's absence. She and Colleen had been close, sharing secrets and dreams, texting each other constantly about small things that seemed trivial but formed the fabric of their relationship. After Colleen's death, Laura had scrolled through those text messages hundreds of times, reading and rereading conversations about what to have for dinner, or what movie to watch, or whether a certain outfit looked good, the mundane details of a life that had ended too soon. Laura's statement focused on those small losses, the accumulation of moments that would never happen. She wrote about how Colleen would never be her maid of honor at her wedding, how they would never take the trip to Ireland they had planned, how Laura would never be able to call her sister when she needed advice or comfort or just someone to laugh with. She wrote about the hole in her life that could never be filled, and how that hole would remain for the rest of her days. The day of the sentencing hearing arrived with winter cold seeping through the courthouse walls, the courtroom filled early, the same faces that had attended the trial returning for this final chapter. Colleen's family sat together in the front row, holding hands, drawing strength from each other because there was nowhere else to find it. Philip was brought in wearing the same dark suit he had worn throughout the trial. He looked thinner, paler, as if the months in detention had begun to wear on him physically, even if they had not touched him emotionally. He took his seat at the defense table and stared straight ahead, his expression carefully neutral. Judge Lowy entered and the room rose. When everyone sat back down, the air felt heavier than usual, charged with anticipation and the weight of what was about to unfold. The judge began by acknowledging the difficulty of the day, the pain that filled the room, the impossibility of any sentence truly balancing the scales of justice. He explained the process that would follow. The family would have an opportunity to speak. The defense would have an opportunity to present any final arguments for leniency. And then he would impose sentence based on the evidence, the law, and his assessment of what justice required. He asked if the family was ready. Peggy Ritzer stood, her legs unsteady, her hands clutching the pages she had written. She walked to the podium and looked directly at Philip. He did not meet her eyes. She began to read, her voice shaking shaking at first, but growing stronger as she continued. She described Colleen's love of teaching, her dedication to her students, her belief that every young person deserved patience and support. She described the hole left in their family, the grief that permeated every holiday and birthday and ordinary Tuesday. She described nights spent crying, days spent struggling to find reasons to keep going, a pain so profound it felt physical. And then Peggy did something that silenced the room. She spoke directly to Philip. She said she did not hate him. She said she could not hate him because Colleen would not have wanted that. But she said she needed him to understand what he had taken. Not just a life, but a universe of possibilities. Every student Colleen would have taught, every life she would have touched, every moment of joy and love and connection she would have experienced. All of it gone because of choices Philip made in a single afternoon. Peggy's voice broke as she finished, and she returned to her seat, collapsing into her husband's arms. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of muffled crying. Even the reporters in the back row, hardened by years of covering tragedies, wiped at their eyes. Laura spoke next, her statement shorter but no less devastating. She described losing not just a sister, but a best friend, a confidant, a person who made her feel safe in a world that often felt overwhelming. She said she would carry Colleen's memory forever, but that memory was no substitute for her presence. When the family finished, the defense attorney stood and made a final plea for mercy. He acknowledged the family's pain and said it was valid and profound, but he urged the judge to consider Philip's age, his capacity for change, the decades of life he still had ahead of him. He argued that sentencing Philip to life without parole would be giving up on a child, consigning him to die in prison without ever having a chance to become the person he might still be capable of becoming. He spoke about redemption and rehabilitation, about research showing that juvenile offenders have lower recidivism rates when given opportunities for growth. It was a well-crafted argument delivered with sincerity, but as he spoke, several jurors who had remained in the gallery shook their heads slightly. They had seen the evidence, they had watched Philip throughout the trial, and they knew what the defense attorney was carefully avoiding, that redemption requires remorse, and Philip had shown none. Judge Lowy listened to everything without interrupting. When the defense attorney finished and sat down, the judge paused. He looked at his notes. He looked at Philip. And then he began to speak. What followed would be remembered as one of the most powerful sentencing statements in Massachusetts legal history. A moment when a judge looked past age and appearance and spoke directly to the heart of what justice means. And Philip Chisholm, who had spent 2 years believing his youth would protect him, was about to learn that some truths transcend age, that consequences are real, and that accountability, once avoided, becomes inescapable. The defense attorney rose slowly, as if the weight of what he was about to argue pressed down on his shoulders. His name was David Patterson, a veteran public defender who had spent 20 years representing clients no one else wanted to defend. He believed deeply in the principle that everyone, regardless of what they had done, deserved competent legal representation. That belief had sustained him through countless difficult cases, but this one was different. He had sat beside Philip Chisholm for 2 years, watched him fail to show remorse, listened to him rationalize and deflect and minimize, and yet here he stood, obligated to make the strongest possible case for mercy. It was his job. It was his duty. And he would do it even knowing that the odds were stacked impossibly against him. Patterson began by acknowledging what could not be denied, that Colleen Ritzer's death was a tragedy, that her family's grief was legitimate and profound, that nothing he said would diminish the horror of what had occurred. But he urged the court to consider context, to remember that the law treats juveniles differently for fundamental reasons rooted in science and humanity. He reminded Judge Lowy that the Supreme Court had ruled in multiple cases that children are constitutionally different from adults, that their crimes, however serious, must be judged through a lens that accounts for immaturity and capacity for change. He cited Miller versus Alabama, a landmark decision that held mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles unconstitutional. He cited Graham versus Florida, which recognized that children have a greater capacity for rehabilitation than adults. The law, he argued, was clear. Age mattered, and Philip was 14. He called his final witness, a neuropsychologist who had not testified during the trial. The doctor was a researcher from a prominent university, someone whose credentials were impeccable and whose testimony carried weight. She explained that Philip's brain was still developing, that the regions responsible for impulse control and understanding long-term consequences would not be fully mature for another decade. She showed the judge brain imaging studies demonstrating differences in neural activity between adolescents and adults when when making decisions under emotional stress. She explained that teenagers are more susceptible to peer influence, more prone to risk-taking behavior, more likely to act without fully considering consequences. None of this excused Philip's actions, she was careful to clarify, but it provided context for understanding why a 14-year-old might commit an act that seemed incomprehensibly brutal. During cross-examination, the prosecutor asked a single question: did any of the research the doctor cited account for premeditation, for planning, for sustained, calculated behavior over an extended period? The doctor hesitated. She admitted that most research on adolescent impulsivity focused on split-second decisions, snap judgments made in the heat of the moment. The prosecutor nodded and asked if the security footage showing Philip calmly disposing of evidence, or his computer searches about juvenile sentencing, or his ability to lie coherently to detectives for hours, suggested impulsive behavior. The doctor said no. Those actions suggested planning and awareness. The prosecutor thanked her and sat down, her point devastatingly clear. Philip's actions did not fit the profile of an impulsive teenager overwhelmed by underdeveloped neurology. They fit the profile of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and believed he could get away with it. Patterson pivoted to his next argument. He introduced evidence of Philip's time in juvenile detention, reports from counselors and educators who worked with him daily. They testified that Philip had participated in classes, earned his high school equivalency diploma, engaged in therapy sessions, and followed institutional rules without incident. One counselor spoke about a conversation where Philip had expressed regret for causing pain, where he had acknowledged that his actions were wrong. It was the closest anyone had come to presenting evidence of remorse, and Patterson seized on it. He argued that this demonstrated Philip's capacity for growth, for understanding, for becoming someone different than the boy who committed this crime. He urged the judge to consider a sentence that included the possibility of parole after a significant period, something that would hold Philip accountable while not extinguishing all hope for eventual redemption. The prosecution dismantled this argument methodically during their rebuttal. They called the same counselor back to the stand and asked more detailed questions. Had Philip ever mentioned Colleen Ritzer by name during these therapy sessions? The counselor admitted he had not. Had Philip ever asked about her family, expressed concern for their well-being, shown interest in the lives he had affected beyond his own? The counselor said no. Had Philip's expression of regret come before or after he learned the jury had returned a guilty verdict? The counselor paused, then admitted it came after. The prosecutor asked if it was possible that Philip's apparent remorse was performative, designed to influence sentencing rather than reflecting genuine change. The counselor said it was possible, though she hoped it was not the case. Her hope, the prosecutor suggested, was not the same as evidence, and hope could not be the foundation for a sentence that would determine whether justice was served. Patterson made one final plea, this time focusing on mercy as a value in itself. He acknowledged that Philip had not been a model defendant, that his lack of visible emotion had been disturbing to many, but he argued that children express emotion differently than adults, that Philip's flat affect might be a defense mechanism rather than evidence of sociopathy. He talked about studies showing that young offenders who receive rehabilitative sentences have lower recidivism rates than those subjected to purely punitive measures. He argued that society benefits when it invests in redemption rather than simply warehousing people in prisons. He reminded the judge that Philip would be in his 30s before he was even eligible for parole under the most lenient possible sentence, that he would spend the formative years of his life behind bars regardless. Was that not punishment enough? Did the court really need to eliminate any possibility of hope? Judge Lowy listened impassively, taking notes, his expression revealing nothing. When Patterson finished and returned to his seat, the judge called a brief recess. People filed out of the courtroom murmuring to each other, debating what they had heard. Legal experts standing in the hallway offered their predictions. Some thought the defense had made a compelling case that might result in a sentence with parole eligibility after 20 or 25 years. Others thought the evidence of premeditation and lack of remorse would lead the judge to impose the harshest sentence available under law. What no one knew was that Judge Lowy had already made his decision. He had made it weeks earlier, after reviewing every piece of evidence, after watching Philip throughout the trial, after seeing that flash of anger when Philip's own mother told the truth. The recess was not about deliberation. It was about giving everyone time to prepare for what came next. When court resumed, the atmosphere atmosphere had shifted. There was a finality in the air, a sense that the long process was about to reach its conclusion. Philip was brought back to the defense table. He sat down and folded his hands, his face once again carefully blank. Colleen's family returned to their seats, holding each other, bracing for whatever came next. Judge Louis entered and took his place at the bench. He looked out at the courtroom, at the faces watching him, waiting for him to speak. And then he began. What followed was not just a sentencing. It was a statement about justice, about accountability, about the limits of mercy when confronted with calculated cruelty. It was a moment that would be quoted in legal journals and debated in law schools. A moment when a judge looked at a boy who had spent 2 years hiding behind his age and told him, in words that could not be misunderstood, that some crimes shatter the protection of youth, and that Philip Chisholm was about to learn exactly what that meant. Judge David Lowy sat at the bench in silence for a long moment, his hands folded on the surface before him, his eyes moving slowly across the courtroom. He looked at Colleen's family, their faces etched with exhaustion and grief. He looked at Philip Chisholm, who sat motionless at the defense table, his expression as blank as it had been throughout the trial. He looked at the attorneys, the court staff, the observers who had filled every available seat, and then he began to speak. His voice was calm, measured, but it carried an authority that silenced every whisper and stilled every movement. What he said next would take nearly 20 minutes to deliver, and every word would land with the weight of finality. The judge began by acknowledging the complexity of the case. He spoke about the legal framework surrounding juvenile defendants, the Supreme Court rulings that recognize children as different from adults. He referenced the research on brain development, the arguments about capacity for change, the philosophical questions about punishment versus rehabilitation. He made it clear that he had considered all of these factors carefully, that he understood the defense's arguments and found them legally sound in principle. But then his tone shifted. He said that while the law recognized juveniles as different, it did not grant them immunity from accountability. It did not suggest that age erased responsibility. It simply required that age be considered as one factor among many, and in this case, the other factors were overwhelming. Judge Lowy turned his attention to the evidence. He described the premeditation demonstrated by Philip's internet searches, the planning evident in his actions, the calculated disposal of evidence. He spoke about the security footage showing Philip moving calmly through the school, displaying none of the panic or emotional distress that might suggest impulsive action. He referenced the interrogation, where Philip had lied repeatedly and shown no genuine remorse. He noted that throughout the trial, Philip had maintained an expression of detachment and indifference that troubled everyone who witnessed it. The judge said that he had watched Philip carefully for any sign of understanding, any indication that the magnitude of what he had done had penetrated his consciousness, and he had seen nothing. Nothing except that brief moment when Philip became angry at his mother for telling the truth. That moment, the judge said, was revealing. It showed not remorse but resentment, not understanding but self-interest. The judge then spoke directly about Colleen Ritzer. He described her not as a statistic or a victim in the abstract, but as a person, a daughter, a sister, a teacher who had dedicated herself to helping young people precisely like Philip. He spoke about the impact statements the family had delivered, about the profound and permanent loss they would carry forever. He said that Colleen had stayed late to help a student, an act of kindness and professional dedication that cost her everything. And he said that Philip had taken advantage of that kindness, had used her willingness to help as an opportunity to commit an act of calculated violence. The judge's voice remained steady, but the words themselves carried an emotional weight that filled the courtroom. This was not just a legal proceeding. This was a moral reckoning. Judge Lowy addressed the defense's arguments about rehabilitation directly. He said he believed in rehabilitation. He said he had granted leniency to many young offenders over his decades on the bench, giving them opportunities to change and grow. But rehabilitation, he explained, required a foundation. It required acknowledgement of wrongdoing. It required genuine remorse. It required some evidence that the person being rehabilitated actually wanted to change. And Philip had provided none of that evidence. Throughout the trial, through 2 years of detention and evaluation and therapy, Philip had shown only the barest performative gestures toward remorse. His expressions of regret were vague and self-focused. He had never spoken about Colleen as a person. He had never asked about her family's pain. He had treated the entire process as something happening to him rather than something he had caused. That, the judge said, was not a foundation for rehabilitation. That was narcissism. The judge spoke about the concept of justice itself. He said justice was not about revenge. It was not about satisfying public anger or making people feel better. Justice was about acknowledging the value of human life and the necessity of consequences when that life was taken. He said that if Philip had been 16 or 17, the calculus might have been different. If he had shown genuine remorse, if he had demonstrated understanding, if his actions suggested impulsivity rather than planning, the sentence might be different. But Philip was 14 and had committed one of the most calculated and brutal crimes the court had seen. His age did not make him less responsible. It made the crime more disturbing, because it suggested that whatever capacity for empathy and moral reasoning should have been developing in him had failed to develop at all. Judge Lowy leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on Philip. He said that the court's responsibility was to protect society, to uphold the law, and to send a clear message about accountability. He said that Philip had spent 2 years believing his age would shield him from serious consequences. That belief, the judge said, ended now. He announced the sentence in clear, deliberate terms. For the murder of Colleen Ritzer, life in prison with eligibility for parole after 40 years. For the aggravated assault, 10 years to be served consecutively. For the robbery, 5 years to be served consecutively. In total, Philip would serve a minimum of 55 years before he could even be considered for parole. He would be nearly 70 years old. Most of his life would be spent behind bars. The chance he had believed his age would grant him did not exist. Justice, the judge said, demanded nothing less. The courtroom erupted in a controlled chaos of emotion. Colleen's family embraced each other, tears streaming down their faces, relief and continued grief mixing together. Some observers nodded in approval. Others sat in stunned silence, processing the severity of the sentence. Philip's mother let out a single, anguished cry before covering her mouth with her hand, and Philip himself sat frozen, his face finally showing something other than blankness, shock, disbelief, the realization that he had miscalculated catastrophically. For 2 years he had believed the system would go easy on him. For 2 years he had convinced himself that his age was a trump card that would override everything else, and in a matter of minutes, Judge Lowy had demolished that illusion completely. The mask Philip had worn so carefully was gone. What remained was a 14-year-old boy finally understanding that his actions had consequences he could not escape. Judge Lowy was not finished. He addressed Philip directly one final time. He said that Philip would have decades to reflect on his choices, to think about Colleen Ritzer and the life he stole from her. He said that perhaps, in that time, Philip would develop the capacity for genuine remorse that he currently lacked. He said that the possibility of parole after 40 years was not a guarantee, but an opportunity, one that would only be granted if Philip demonstrated real change. And he said that if Philip never developed that capacity, if he remained the person he appeared to be now, then he would die in prison. The choice in some ways was Philip's, but Colleen would never have a choice again. Her family would never have her back. And that reality, the judge said, was what justice required acknowledging above all else. The hearing concluded. Philip was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his legs unsteady, his face drained of color. He did not look back at his mother. He did not look at anyone. He simply walked through the side door and disappeared, beginning a journey that would take him to an adult prison where he would spend the rest of his youth and most of his adulthood. Behind him, Colleen's family remained in the courtroom, holding each other, finally allowing themselves to breathe. The verdict had been delivered. The sentence had been imposed. It would never bring Colleen back. It would never erase their pain. But it confirmed something they needed to hear, that her life had mattered, that her death was not meaningless, and that the boy who took her from them would be held accountable in a way that matched the severity of what he had done. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered to deliver the news to cameras and audiences around the world. And in courtrooms across the country, judges and lawyers and advocates would debate this sentence for years to come, arguing about age and justice and whether Judge Lowy had made the right call. But in that moment, in that courtroom in Salem, Massachusetts, there was only silence and the sense that something profound had just occurred. Justice had been served, and everyone present understood that they had witnessed something historic. Judge David Lowy remained at the bench after announcing the sentence, his hands still folded, his expression serious but not harsh. The courtroom had begun to settle after the initial wave of reactions, and he indicated with a small gesture that he was not yet finished. People shifted in their seats, realizing that what they had just heard was not the end of his remarks, but rather the legal conclusion. What came next would be something different, something more personal. The judge took a breath and began to speak again, his voice quieter now but no less powerful. He said he wanted to explain his reasoning in terms that went beyond legal legal precedent and sentencing guidelines. He wanted to speak not just as a judge, but as a human being who had spent weeks absorbing the details of this case. He began by addressing the question that had dominated public discourse since Philip's arrest. Could a 14-year-old truly understand the weight of taking a life? The judge said yes, unequivocally yes. He explained that while adolescent brains are still developing, 14-year-olds understand death. They understand permanence. They understand that actions have consequences. The law allows 14-year-olds to be held criminally responsible because society recognizes that by that age, fundamental moral reasoning has developed. Children know that hurting others is wrong. They know that killing is wrong. What they sometimes lack is impulse control, the ability to stop themselves in a moment of anger or fear. But Philip's crime, the judge emphasized, was not impulsive. It was planned. It was executed with chilling methodical precision. And that changed everything. Judge Lowy spoke about the nature of premeditation. He said that when someone researches sentencing guidelines before committing a crime, they are demonstrating awareness of consequences. When someone takes steps to hide evidence, they are showing consciousness of guilt. When someone lies to investigators with coherent, practiced stories, they are proving they understand right from wrong and are attempting to evade accountability. Philip had done all of these things. The judge said he had reviewed the security footage dozens of times, watching Philip move through empty hallways with a recycling bin containing Colleen's body. There was no panic in Philip's movements, no hesitation, no visible distress. He looked like someone completing a task, checking items off a mental list. That level of composure was not consistent with a child overwhelmed by emotion or unable to control himself. It was consistent with someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The judge then addressed the issue of remorse, or rather, the absence of it. He said that in his decades on the bench, he had seen many defendants express regret. Some were genuine, breaking down in tears, unable to articulate their shame and horror at what they had done. Others were performative, saying the right words but displaying body language that contradicted their claims. Philip fell into neither category. He had barely expressed regret at all. The few times he had mentioned feeling bad, his statements were abstract and self-focused. He talked about being upset or confused, but never about Colleen, never about her family, never about the students who lost a teacher they loved or the community that lost someone who made it better. The judge said this absence of victim-focused remorse was one of the most troubling aspects of the entire case. It suggested that Philip viewed the crime primarily through the lens of how it affected him rather than how it had destroyed others. Judge Lowy spoke directly to the concept of rehabilitation. He said he believed deeply in second chances. He had granted them many times to young offenders who showed genuine desire to change, but rehabilitation could not be imposed. It had to come from within. It required the defendant to first acknowledge the full scope of what they had done, to sit with that acknowledgement no matter how painful, and to emerge with a commitment to becoming someone different. Philip had not begun that process. In 2 years of detention, therapy, and evaluation, he had resisted genuine introspection. He had minimized, rationalized, and deflected. The judge said that perhaps Philip would change. Perhaps 40 years in prison would eventually break through whatever psychological barriers prevented him from feeling authentic remorse. But the court could not sentence based on hope. It had to sentence based on the person Philip was now. And that person, had shown no indication of understanding or caring about the devastation he had caused. The judge addressed Philip's age one final time. He acknowledged that 14 seemed young, that looking at Philip sitting at the defense table, he appeared small and vulnerable. But appearances, the judge said, could be deceiving. The law set 14 as the minimum age for adult prosecution in cases like this, because legislators and judges over generations had determined that by that age, children possess sufficient moral and cognitive development to be held fully accountable for the most serious crimes. The judge said he agreed with that determination, not because he lacked compassion for children, not because he believed teenagers were fully formed adults, but because he believed that accountability was the foundation of a civilized society. And accountability meant that when you take a life deliberately and without justification, you face consequences proportional to that act regardless of how old you are. Judge Lowy turned his attention to Colleen's family. He spoke directly to them, his voice softening slightly. He said he knew that no sentence would bring Colleen back. He knew that they would carry their grief for the rest of their lives. He said he hoped that today's outcome would provide some measure of closure, some confirmation that the justice system recognized the value of Colleen's life and the severity of her loss. He said that Colleen had represented the best of what teachers could be. Peggy, patient, dedicated, selfless. She had stayed late to help a student because that was who she was, and she had paid for that kindness with her life. The judge said that in imposing this sentence, he was honoring Colleen's memory and sending a message that people like her, people who dedicate themselves to helping others, deserve protection and justice when they are harmed. The judge then spoke about the broader implications of the case. He acknowledged that it would be debated in law schools and courtrooms for years to come. He said he welcomed that debate. Democracy required citizens to question and challenge the decisions of those in power, but he wanted to be clear about his reasoning. This sentence was not about revenge. It was not about public pressure or media attention. It was about applying the law fairly and consistently to the facts of this specific case. Another 14-year-old who committed a crime in the heat of passion, who showed genuine remorse, who had no evidence of premeditation, might receive a different sentence, because every case was different, every defendant was different. But Philip Chisholm had committed one of the most calculated and cold-blooded crimes the court had encountered, and the sentence reflected that reality. Judge Lowy looked at Philip one final time. He said that Philip would have decades to think about his choices, that the doors of personal growth and change were not permanently closed, that if Philip truly dedicated himself to understanding what he had done and becoming a better person, the parole board might one day grant him release. But that day was far in the future, and whether it ever came depended entirely on whether Philip could finally develop the capacity for genuine remorse and empathy that he currently lacked. The judge said he hoped Philip would use his time in prison wisely, that he would reflect, learn, and grow. But hope was not the basis for this sentence. Justice was. And justice, in this case, demanded that Philip Chisholm spend the majority of his life behind bars, paying for the life he stole from Colleen Ritzer. The judge's final words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. He gathered his papers, rose from the bench, and left the courtroom. And with that, the case that had captivated a nation reached its conclusion. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and cameras when Colleen's family emerged into the cold December afternoon. Microphones thrust forward, voices called out questions, but the family's attorney raised his hand and asked for quiet. Peggy Ritzer stood at the center of the group, her husband Tom beside her with his arm around her shoulders, their daughter Laura on her other side. They had prepared a brief statement, something they could say to acknowledge the moment without having to relive every painful detail again. Peggy unfolded a piece of paper with shaking hands and began to read. Her voice was soft but steady, strengthened by the outcome they had just witnessed inside. She thanked the prosecutors, the investigators, and everyone who had worked tirelessly to bring Philip to justice. She thanked the community for their support over the past 2 years, for the vigils and letters and gestures of kindness that had helped them survive the darkest period of their lives. She said that no sentence could ever truly balance the scales when a life as beautiful as Colleen's had been taken. But she said the sentence handed down today confirmed something essential, that Colleen's life had value, that her death mattered, that the justice system recognized the severity of what had been done to her. Peggy paused, her eyes filling with tears, and said that she hoped other families would never have to go through what they had endured. She hoped that Colleen's story would remind people to cherish the teachers in their lives, to recognize the sacrifice and dedication required of those who work with young people every day. And then she folded the paper and stepped back, unable to say more. The district attorney held her own press conference on the other side of the courthouse. She stood at a podium flanked by the prosecutors who had built the case, and she spoke about the precedent this sentence might set. She acknowledged that charging juveniles as adults was always controversial, that reasonable people could disagree about where to draw lines between childhood and accountability. But she said that in cases involving premeditated violence, cases where the evidence showed calculated decision-making rather than impulsive action, the law allowed for adult prosecution, and Judge Lowy's sentence confirmed that such prosecution was not only legally permissible but morally necessary. She said the office would continue evaluating each juvenile case individually, considering all relevant factors. But Philip Chisholm's case demonstrated that age alone could not excuse actions that revealed such profound disregard for human life. Inside the courthouse, Philip was processed for transfer to adult prison. He had been held in a juvenile facility during the trial, housed separately from other detainees due to the high-profile nature of his case. But that chapter was over. He would now be moved to a medium-security adult facility where he would begin serving his sentence. The logistics were complex. Massachusetts law required that juveniles sentenced as adults be housed in age-appropriate facilities until they turned 18, with gradual integration into the adult population. But the protections were minimal. Philip would attend classes to complete his education. He would have access to counseling and programming, but he would do so knowing that the vast majority of his life would be spent within prison walls, that the world outside would move on without him, that every birthday and holiday and milestone would occur in the same gray institutional environment. The media coverage was intense and divided. National news networks ran segments analyzing the sentence, inviting legal experts and child advocates to debate whether justice had been served or whether the system had failed. Some commentators praised Judge Lowy's courage in imposing a sentence that acknowledged the severity of the crime regardless of the defendant's age. They argued that society needed to send a clear message that certain acts were so heinous that youth provided no shelter from consequences. Others criticized the sentence as excessively harsh, arguing that it essentially consigned a teenager to die in prison, that it abandoned any pretense of rehabilitation in favor of pure retribution. The debate played out in op-eds and social media threads, with people on both sides citing research and personal beliefs to support their positions. But those who had actually sat through the trial, who had seen the evidence and watched Philip's demeanor, largely supported the sentence. They understood what statistics and abstractions could not convey, that this was not a typical case of juvenile impulsivity. This was something colder and more calculated. Back in Danvers, life slowly returned to a version of normal. The high school had reopened weeks after Colleen's death, with increased security and ongoing counseling support for traumatized students and staff. Her classroom had been transformed into a memorial space, but eventually it was needed for teaching again. The school held a ceremony before converting it back, allowing students and teachers one final opportunity to leave messages and flowers. Then the space was cleared and a new teacher moved in, someone who understood the weight of working in a room where tragedy had occurred, but who also believed in education's power to heal and transform. A scholarship was established in Colleen's name, awarded annually to a graduating senior planning to pursue teaching. Her family created a foundation focused on supporting educators and promoting school safety. They channeled their grief into action, finding purpose in ensuring that Colleen's legacy extended beyond the manner of her death. Philip's family faced their own difficult journey. His mother struggled with guilt and grief, questioning every decision she had made as a parent, wondering if there were warning signs she had missed or interventions she could have pursued. She received hate mail and threats from people who blamed her for Philip's actions, as if parenting alone could have prevented such a calculated crime. Some friends and relatives stood by her, recognizing that she too was a victim of Philip's choices. Others distanced themselves, unable to separate her from what her son had done. She moved away from Massachusetts eventually, seeking anonymity in a place where the name Philip Chisholm did not immediately trigger recognition and rage. She would visit him in prison occasionally, though those visits were painful and often ended with more questions than answers. She wanted to believe her son could change, that the boy she had raised still existed somewhere beneath the cold exterior. But as years passed, that hope grew dimmer. Legal scholars began analyzing Judge Lowy's sentencing statement, incorporating it into discussions about juvenile justice and moral culpability. Law schools used the case as a teaching tool, asking students to grapple with the competing values of accountability and rehabilitation. Some professors argued that the sentence was legally sound but morally troubling, that it reflected a punitive approach inconsistent with developmental science. Others argued that it represented exactly the kind of nuanced decision-making the law required, acknowledging that age was one factor among many rather than an absolute shield. The debate was productive and thoughtful, far removed from the emotional intensity of the trial itself. But for those who had been directly affected, the academic discussions felt distant and abstract. Colleen's family did not care about legal theory. They cared that their daughter was gone and that the person responsible would spend his life paying for that choice. Philip adjusted to prison life slowly and with difficulty. He was assigned to a unit with other young offenders, housed separately from the general population due to his age. He attended mandatory education classes and participated in therapeutic programming, though staff noted he remained emotionally detached and resistant to genuine introspection. Other inmates knew why he was there. Word spread quickly in prison, and while he was not physically harmed, he was isolated and avoided. Even in a population of people serving serious sentences, there was a hierarchy, and those who harmed children or teachers occupied the lowest rung. Philip learned to keep his head down, to follow rules, to blend into routines. But he did not learn remorse. Not in the first year, not in the fifth. He existed in a state of emotional suspension, aware that he had lost his freedom, but seemingly unable or unwilling to confront why. Years would pass. The world outside would change. Technology would advance. Political landscapes would shift. People who had followed the trial would move on to other stories, other outrages, other tragedies. But for Colleen's family, time did not heal all wounds. They learned to carry their grief differently, to integrate it into their lives rather than being consumed by it. They celebrated her birthday each year, gathering together to share memories and keep her alive in their hearts. They attended graduations of students who had been in her classes, watching young people thrive, and knowing that Colleen had played a part in shaping who they became. They found moments of joy and meaning, proof that life could continue even after devastating loss. But they never forgot, and they never stopped missing her. The empty chair at family gatherings remained a reminder of what had been stolen. And Philip Chisholm's name remained synonymous with a betrayal of trust so profound it would never be forgiven, even if decades from now some parole board decided he had served enough time. 10 years after the sentencing, a journalist returned to Danvers to write a retrospective on the case. She walked through the high school hallways during a quiet afternoon, escorted by a principal who had not been there when Colleen taught, but who knew the story intimately. The building had been renovated since then, fresh paint and updated security systems, but the second floor still carried echoes of that October day. Room 229 was occupied by a geometry teacher named Mr. Henshaw, a soft-spoken man in his 30s who had accepted the position knowing its history. He kept a small photo of Colleen on his desk, not as a shrine but as a reminder that teaching was sacred work, that the relationships between educators and students were built on trust, and that trust, once violated, left scars that never fully disappeared. The journalist spoke with former students who had been freshmen when Colleen died. They were in their mid-20s now, building careers and families, living lives that stretched far beyond those traumatic teenage years. But every one of them remembered. They remembered the morning announcement that school was closed. They remembered learning that Miss Ritzer was gone. They remembered the vigils and the tears, and the way adults suddenly seemed fragile and uncertain. Several said the experience had changed them fundamentally, made them more aware of mortality and violence, stripped away a certain innocence about safety and trust. One young woman said she had become a teacher partially because of Colleen, wanting to honor her memory by dedicating herself to the same profession. She taught math at a middle school 2 towns over, and she thought about Colleen often, especially when she stayed late to help struggling students. She was always careful now, always aware. The world felt different after learning that danger could come from the most unexpected places. The Ritzer family had found a rhythm in their grief, though calling it acceptance felt too generous. Peggy had retired from her job and devoted herself to the foundation they had created in Colleen's name. The foundation provided grants to schools for safety improvements and mental health resources. It funded scholarships for aspiring teachers. It organized annual remembrance events that brought together educators and families to discuss both Colleen's legacy and the broader issues her death had highlighted. Tom remained more private, attending events but rarely speaking publicly. The pain was still too raw, even after a decade. Laura had gotten married 3 years earlier, a ceremony that was joyful but also profoundly sad because Colleen was not there to serve as maid of honor as they had always planned. An empty chair was placed at the reception with Colleen's photograph on it, a physical acknowledgement of absence that made some guests uncomfortable but felt necessary to the family. Philip Chisholm turned 24 in prison. He had spent nearly a third of his life incarcerated, the entirety of his adult existence contained within institutional walls. He had earned additional educational credentials, participated in various programs, and maintained a disciplinary record that was mostly clean. But those who interacted with him regularly, counselors and teachers and corrections officers, consistently noted the same troubling pattern. He went through the motions without genuine engagement. He said appropriate things during therapy but demonstrated no real emotional depth. He had never, in 10 years, spoken about Colleen Ritzer with anything resembling authentic remorse. He referred to the incident, or what happened in abstract terms, always maintaining emotional distance from the reality of what he had done. A prison psychologist included in her most recent evaluation that Philip displayed markers consistent with narcissistic personality disorder and profound empathy deficits. She concluded that while he understood intellectually that his actions were wrong, he lacked the emotional capacity to truly feel the weight of another person's suffering. The legal landscape around juvenile sentencing had continued evolving during those 10 years. New research emerged about brain development and rehabilitation potential. Some states modified their laws to make it harder to try juveniles as adults or to impose lengthy sentences on teenage defendants. Advocacy groups pointed to Philip's case as an example of excessive punishment, arguing that sentencing a 14-year-old to 55 years was tantamount to life without parole despite the technical parole eligibility. But others pointed to the same case as proof that age-based leniency had limits, that some crimes were so carefully planned and brutally executed that they demanded consequences regardless of the perpetrator's date of birth. Judge Lowy, now retired, occasionally gave lectures at law schools about his decision. He never wavered in his belief that the sentence was just. He acknowledged the difficulty, the weight of imposing such a lengthy term on someone so young. But he said that justice sometimes required hard choices, that protecting the vulnerable and holding offenders accountable were obligations that could not be abandoned simply because those obligations felt uncomfortable. In the prison's law library, Philip could sometimes be found researching appellate options and parole procedures. He had filed several motions over the years challenging aspects of his conviction and sentence, all of them denied. He wrote letters to his mother describing prison life in mundane detail, rarely mentioning the crime that brought him there. He maintained a sense that somehow, eventually, there would be a way out, that a legal technicality or a sympathetic parole board or a change in sentencing laws would provide an escape. This persistent belief that consequences were negotiable, that accountability could still be avoided, was perhaps the clearest evidence that he remained fundamentally unchanged. The teenage boy who had researched juvenile sentencing before committing murder had become an adult who continued researching ways to minimize his punishment. The methodology had evolved, but the mindset remained identical. The anniversary of Colleen's death arrived each October, like clockwork, a marker that time continued passing even when grief felt suspended. The Danvers community held small memorial services, less formal than the massive vigils of earlier years, but no less meaningful. Former students brought flowers to a memorial bench installed near the high school. Teachers paused to remember a colleague they had lost. And Colleen's family gathered privately, sharing stories and tears, keeping her memory alive through the only means available to them. They talked about what she would be doing if she were still alive. She would be 34 now. She might have married, had children of her own. She might have become a department chair or pursued a master's degree. She might have touched hundreds more lives. All of those possibilities had been erased by choices made in a classroom on an ordinary October afternoon. And the person who made those choices sat in a prison cell, no closer to understanding the magnitude of what he had taken. The journalist concluded her retrospective with a question she posed to everyone she interviewed. Had justice been served? The answers varied. Colleen's family said yes, though they acknowledged that no sentence could ever truly balance the scales. They said the length of Philip's sentence reflected the value of Colleen's life and the severity of his crime. Some legal advocates said no, arguing that sentencing a teenager to die in prison violated principles of proportionality and human dignity. Former jurors were divided, some comfortable with the outcome, and others troubled by its harshness when they saw Philip's young face in their memories. The community itself seemed to have reached a collective conclusion that fell somewhere in between. Most believed Philip deserved serious consequences, but some wondered if 55 years was too long, if there should have been a mechanism for earlier review if he demonstrated genuine change. But perhaps the most important perspective belonged to the teachers who had known Colleen and who continued working in schools every day. They said justice was not just about punishment, it was about acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that teachers deserve to be safe in their classrooms, that their willingness to help students should not make them targets, that when someone violated that trust so profoundly, there had to be consequences severe enough to send a message. They said Philip's sentence told educators that their lives had value, that the system would protect them even after the worst had happened. And in a profession where teachers often felt undervalued and overlooked, that message mattered more than any academic debate about juvenile brain development or rehabilitation potential. As the journalist prepared to leave Danvers, she visited Colleen's grave. It was in a quiet cemetery on the edge of town, beneath an oak tree that turned brilliant colors each fall. The headstone was simple, engraved with her name, her dates, and a single line that captured who she had been. A teacher who believed in every student. Flowers covered the ground around it, some fresh and some wilted, evidence of people who still remembered and still mourned. The journalist stood there for a long time, thinking about innocence and evil, about children and monsters, about justice and mercy. She thought about Philip Chisholm sitting in a cell, 30 years still remaining before he would even be eligible for parole. She thought about whether he would ever truly understand what he had done, or whether that capacity simply did not exist in him. And she thought about Colleen, who had stayed late to help a student and paid for that kindness with everything. The story did not have a neat ending. Real stories rarely do. Philip would remain in prison for decades, going through the motions of rehabilitation without achieving its substance. Colleen's family would continue grieving, finding meaning where they could, but never escaping the loss. The community would move forward, other tragedies and triumphs eventually overshadowing this one in collective memory. But for those directly touched by what happened in room 229, the impact would last a lifetime. And perhaps that was the final truth of the case, that some actions create ripples that never stop spreading, that taking a life does not just destroy one person, but damages everyone connected to that person in ways both visible and invisible. That accountability, while necessary, cannot undo harm. It can only acknowledge it, and in acknowledging it, perhaps, allow those left behind to continue living. Not happily, not without pain, but with the knowledge that the person they lost was valued enough to demand justice, and that justice, however imperfect, was delivered.